It was a typical Monday morning at the county courthouse, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of polished wood. People shuffled in and out, each carrying their burdens, some hoping for justice, others simply wishing to get the day over with. Judge Carter Montgomery, a man known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach to the law, adjusted his robe as he prepared to hear his next case. His reputation was built on fairness, or so he believed, and he had little patience for excuses. His courtroom was his kingdom, and he ruled it with an iron fist. Today, the docket was packed. The usual parade of speeding tickets, noise complaints, and unpaid fines filled the list. But it was case number 347 that caught his attention. Mrs. Aliyah Harper, the clerk announced as a tall, poised woman in her late 30s stepped forward. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue suit, Aliyah exuded an air of quiet confidence that immediately set her apart from the others in the courtroom. Her dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her calm demeanor suggested she had nothing to hide. Judge Montgomery barely glanced at her as he scanned the details of the case file. It was straightforward, or so it seemed. A parking violation that had gone unpaid for months. The fine wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Mrs. Harper, he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Do you realize how long this fine has been overdue? Aliyah met his gaze without flinching. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady. But there's a misunderstanding I'd like to explain. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. In his experience, everyone had a story, a reason why they were late, why they couldn't pay, or why the rules didn't apply to them. He'd heard them all before, and none of them ever seemed to hold water. A misunderstanding, you say? He replied with a hint of skepticism. Enlighten me. The courtroom fell silent as Aliyah began to speak. But before she could get far, Judge Montgomery cut her off. Save it, he said, waving a dismissive hand. This is a simple matter. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay it, or further legal action will be taken. Aliyah's calm exterior didn't waver, but a flicker of something, amusement, flashed in her eyes. She nodded politely and said, Understood, Your Honor. But if I may ask, do you live at 124 Maple Street? The question caught Judge Montgomery off guard. His head snapped up, and for the first time he really looked at the woman standing before him. Why do you ask? He said, his voice sharp. Aliyah smiled faintly, her composure unshaken. Because I believe you're my tenant. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the weight of her words sunk in. Judge Montgomery's face, usually as unreadable as stone, betrayed a flicker of confusion. Tenant, how could this be? His mind raced, trying to piece together the implications of her claim. Was this some kind of ploy? A last-ditch effort to gain leverage in her case. Explain yourself, he demanded, his tone harsher now, though a sliver of uncertainty crept in. Aliyah remained unbothered, her hands clasped in front of her. It's quite simple, Your Honor, she said. I own the property where you currently reside. Perhaps you didn't realize it because I work through a property management company, but I assure you the deed is in my name. And as it happens, I recently received a notice that the rent is past due. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Montgomery sat frozen, his mind churning with disbelief. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. For the first time in his career, he was at a loss for words. How could this be possible? And what did it mean for the power dynamic that had just shifted so drastically before his eyes? As Aliyah's calm gaze met his once more, a question lingered unspoken between them. What happens when the scales of justice are unexpectedly tipped? Judge Montgomery's grip tightened around his gavel as Aliyah Harper's words sunk in. His tenant? This couldn't be true. He prided himself on keeping his personal and professional lives separate, maintaining an image of control and competence. But now, standing in front of him, this poised woman had upended his sense of order with a single sentence. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and the judge's face flushed. Order, he barked, his voice cutting through the chatter. The room quieted, but the weight of her statement hung heavy in the air. He stared at Aliyah, searching her expression for any sign of deceit. She looked back at him steadily, her composure unshaken. "Do you have proof of this claim?" he had asked, his voice carefully measured. He needed to regain control of the situation, but even as he spoke, a nagging thought crept into his mind. The address she'd mentioned, -124 Maple Street, was indeed his residence. He'd rented the place through a property management company over a year ago, signing the lease without giving much thought to the owner behind it. Could she really be telling the truth? Aliyah nodded, her confidence unyielding. "Of course, Your Honor. I can provide all the necessary documentation, including the deed to the property and the rental agreement. I didn't bring it with me today, but I can have it delivered to the court if needed." Judge Montgomery felt a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, especially not in his own courtroom. He cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. "That won't be necessary," he said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. "For now, we'll proceed with the matter at hand. The fine stands." He expected her to protest, but Aliyah simply nodded again, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "As you wish, Your Honor," she said, her tone polite, but with an edge of something he couldn't quite place. Was it satisfaction? She turned and walked back to her seat, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The sound seemed deafening in the otherwise silent room. The rest of the court session passed in a blur. Judge Montgomery handled each case with his usual efficiency, but his mind kept drifting back to Aliyah Harper. Her claim gnawed at him, unsettling the carefully constructed routine of his day. By the time he adjourned court for the afternoon, he was desperate for answers. Later, in the privacy of his chambers, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. It didn't take long to find the lease agreement for his rental. Sure enough, the property owner listed was Aliyah Harper. He stared at the name, his heart sinking. She hadn't been bluffing. The realization hit him like a freight train. This woman, the one he'd just found in his courtroom, was the same person he owed rent to. And if what she'd said was true, he was behind on his payments. How had he let this slip through the cracks? He prided himself on being meticulous, yet somehow he'd failed to notice something this significant. As the hours passed, his initial disbelief turned to unease. He replayed the interaction in his mind, analyzing every detail. Aliyah hadn't been aggressive or confrontational, but there had been a quiet power in the way she spoke. She knew exactly what she was doing when she mentioned the address, and she'd done it with precision. But why? Was it merely to embarrass him, or was there something more at play? Meanwhile, Aliyah left the courthouse feeling a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. She hadn't planned to reveal her connection to Judge Montgomery in such a public setting, but his dismissive attitude had left her no choice. She wasn't one to back down, especially not when fairness was at stake. As she drove home, her thoughts drifted to the events that had led her here. Aliyah had worked hard to build a life for herself, overcoming countless obstacles along the way. She had purchased the property at 124 Maple Street years ago as an investment, never imagining it would one day become a key piece in such an unusual encounter. When the property management company informed her of a delinquent tenant, she hadn't given it much thought, until she saw the name on the lease. Carter Montgomery. The name had sparked recognition immediately. She'd read about him in the local papers, seen his name mentioned in connection with high-profile cases. He was a respected figure in the community, known for his sharp intellect and unwavering adherence to the law. But now he was also her tenant, a tenant who hadn't paid his rent in 2 months. At first, she considered handling the matter quietly, letting the property management company address the issue. But when her parking fine appeared in the mail, she couldn't ignore the coincidence. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next day, as Judge Montgomery sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the property management company, reminding him of his overdue rent. The timing couldn't have been worse. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had the money to pay. It wasn't about that. But the thought of sending payment to Aliyah Harper, of acknowledging her power over him, was a bitter pill to swallow. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he'd underestimated her. Alia wasn't just another name on a case file. She was intelligent, composed, and unafraid to challenge him, even in his own domain. For a man used to holding the upper hand, it was a humbling realization. As the week went on, their paths crossed again. This time, it wasn't in the courtroom, but at a local charity event. Judge Montgomery had been invited as a guest of honor, and to his surprise, Alia was there too. She was mingling with a group of attendees, her laughter ringing out above the hum of conversation. When she saw him, her expression didn't change, but her eyes held a knowing look that sent a shiver down his spine. "Good evening, Judge," she said when they finally came face to face. Her tone was warm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Mrs. Harper," he replied, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," she said, her smile never wavering. "But then again, it seems our paths are destined to cross, doesn't it?" He chuckled nervously, unsure of how to respond. The dynamic between them had shifted once again, and he felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. Alia, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease, as if she held all the cards. Their conversation was brief, but it left Judge Montgomery with more questions than answers. What was Alia's endgame? Was she simply enjoying the irony of their situation, or did she have a larger plan in mind? As the night wore on, he found himself watching her from across the room, trying to decipher the enigma that was Alia Harper. Little did he know their story was far from over. The tension between Judge Carter Montgomery and Alia Harper simmered beneath the surface, growing with each passing day. Neither of them openly acknowledged the tangled connection that now linked their lives, but it was there, a silent force shaping their every interaction. For Carter, it was a humbling reminder that even his carefully structured world wasn't immune to disruption. For Alia, it was an unexpected opportunity to test the boundaries of justice, power, and fairness. The courthouse was quieter than usual the following week, but Carter couldn't shake the weight pressing down on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Alia's calm, knowing expression. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being her tenant that troubled him. There was something deeper, a sense that she was testing him in ways he couldn't quite grasp. One morning, as he reviewed the cases scheduled for the day, he saw her name on the docket again. This time, it wasn't about the parking fine. The case involved a dispute over a property she owned, another tenant claiming she had failed to make necessary repairs. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just days ago, he had been the one standing in judgment of her. Now she was back in his courtroom, this time as a defendant. When Alia entered, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence as before, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders, as if she anticipated the scrutiny. Carter's gaze met hers briefly before he turned his attention to the paperwork. He couldn't afford to let personal feelings cloud his judgment that the situation was far from ordinary. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the tenant's complaints weren't as straightforward as they seemed. Alia had provided evidence of multiple attempts to address the issues, including emails, invoices, and even photographs of the repairs. But the tenant, a man named Greg Foster, was adamant that she had neglected her duties as a landlord. "I did everything in my power to resolve the situation," Alia said, her voice steady but firm. Mr. Foster refused to grant access to the property on several occasions, which made it impossible to complete the work. Greg Foster, a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, shook his head. "That's not true. I gave her every chance to fix the problems, but she didn't care. She just wanted her rent." Carter observed them both carefully. Alia's professionalism was evident, but Greg's agitation suggested there was more to the story. The room was tense as the two presented their arguments, each trying to prove their case. Carter couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. People were watching him closely, likely wondering how he would handle a case involving someone with whom he had an unexpected connection. As the hearing progressed, Carter's mind wandered to his own overdue rent. Alia hadn't mentioned it again, but the knowledge of his delinquency hung over him like a dark cloud. Was she silently judging him, just as he was judging her now? The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Outside the courtroom, the whispers had already begun. Staff members, attorneys, and even a few regular attendees speculated about the unusual dynamic between the judge and the defendant. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by the odd coincidence of their landlord-tenant relationship. Carter tried to ignore the buzz, but it was impossible to escape. Every glance, every hushed conversation felt like a reminder of his precarious position. For Alia, the situation was equally complicated. She had entered the courtroom that day determined to defend her reputation. But the added layer of her connection to Judge Montgomery made everything more complex. She couldn't deny the power imbalance between them, even though she technically held the upper hand outside the courtroom. But here, in this space, he was still the one with the gavel. Later that evening, Carter sat alone in his chambers, reviewing the evidence from the case. He found himself replaying Alia's words in his mind, analyzing her tone, her expressions. There was no denying her competence or her determination. But there was also a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just his landlord or a defendant in his courtroom. She was a person navigating challenges of her own, just as he was. Meanwhile, Alia returned home feeling a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The courtroom had always been a place of justice in her mind, a space where truth prevailed. But now she understood how fragile that ideal could be. A situation with Carter was a reminder of the complexities that came with power, privilege, and perception. As days turned into weeks, the tension between them remained unresolved. Carter finally paid his overdue rent, but the act felt hollow. It wasn't about the money. It was about the unspoken questions lingering between them. Why had Alia chosen to reveal their connection in court? Was it a calculated move or simply a slip of the tongue? And what did it mean for their future interactions? Their paths continued to cross, both in and out of the courtroom. Each encounter added another layer to their complicated relationship. A chance meeting at a coffee shop turned into a brief but awkward conversation. A community meeting brought them face to face once again, forcing them to acknowledge the growing web of connections that tied them together. Through it all, the unresolved tension lingered. Carter found himself questioning the nature of justice and fairness in ways he never had before. Alia, too, grappled with the challenges of holding someone accountable while respecting the delicate balance of power and authority. But one thing was clear: their story was far from over. The conflicts that had brought them together were only the beginning of a journey neither of them had anticipated, one that would challenge their beliefs, their values, and their understanding of what it truly meant to be fair. The tension between Carter and Alia grew like an invisible thread tightening around them, pulling their lives into an increasingly tangled knot. The courtroom, once a space of rigid rules and clear roles, had become a stage where their personal and professional worlds collided in ways neither could have imagined. Every case that brought Alia back before Carter seemed to intensify the unspoken questions between them. Was he truly impartial? Was she using their connection to her advantage? Or was something deeper driving these encounters? It wasn't long before the whispers around the courthouse turned into murmurs loud enough to reach Carter's ears. The gossip wasn't just about their landlord-tenant relationship anymore. People were beginning to speculate about their motivations, their intentions, even their characters. Some accused Alia of trying to humiliate the judge, leveraging her position as his landlord to gain sympathy in her legal disputes. Others suggested Carter was bending the rules, either to protect himself or to retaliate subtly. Both rumors stung, though neither was true. The breaking point came when a new case landed on Carter's docket. A legal dispute between Alia and another property owner. It was a complex matter involving zoning rights, with significant financial stakes for both parties. The case promised to draw attention, not just because of the high-profile nature of the disagreement, but also because of the history between Carter and Alia. By the time the hearing was scheduled, the courtroom was packed with onlookers, reporters, and even a few activists who had picked up on the racial undertones of the situation. The tension in the room was palpable. Alia arrived early, her demeanor as composed as ever, but there was an unmistakable fire in her eyes. She knew this case wasn't just about property rights. It was about proving that she wouldn't be intimidated, no matter how much scrutiny she faced. Carter, meanwhile, was doing everything in his power to project neutrality, but inside he felt like he was walking a tightrope. Every decision he made would be judged, not just by the legal community, but by the public as well. As the case unfolded, the stakes became even clearer. Olea presented a meticulous argument, supported by detailed evidence and expert testimony. Her opponent, a wealthy developer named Douglas Crane, countered with a polished legal team and an air of entitlement that made Carter's stomach turn. Crane's lawyers painted Olea as an overreaching landlord trying to block progress for her own gain, while Olea's team emphasized her commitment to protecting her community and upholding ethical property practices. Carter listened intently, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions. But even as he maintained his judicial composure, he couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. Every glance from the gallery felt like a reminder of how closely his actions were being watched. He knew that no matter what decision he made, someone would accuse him of bias. As the arguments drew to a close, the tension in the room reached its peak. Olea's lawyer delivered a passionate closing statement, emphasizing the broader implications of the case for local residents. Crane's team responded with a calculated appeal to the letter of the law, warning against setting a precedent that could hinder development. By the time the hearing ended, the air was thick with anticipation. After adjourning the court for the day, Carter retreated to his chambers, his mind racing. The evidence was clear enough, but the personal connection to Olea complicated everything. He couldn't deny that her arguments were compelling. But was he unconsciously swayed by their shared history? And what if he ruled against her? Would people believe he was overcompensating to prove his impartiality? That night, as he sat in his dimly lit study, Carter found himself replaying every interaction he'd had with Olea since that fateful parking fine. He thought about her composure, her determination, and the way she faced every challenge with unwavering resolve. He thought about the sacrifices she must have made to reach this point, and the way she carried the weight of expectation with such quiet strength. And he thought about himself, about the privilege he'd taken for granted and the blind spots he'd ignored. Meanwhile, Olea sat in her own home, reflecting on the day's events. She couldn't shake the feeling that this case was about more than property rights. It was about fairness, about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. She knew the risks of putting herself in such a vulnerable position, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. As the city buzzed with speculation about the case, both Carter and Olea found themselves grappling with questions they couldn't answer. What did justice really mean in a world where power and privilege were so unevenly distributed? How could they navigate a relationship defined by such an unusual mix of conflict and connection? And most importantly, what would happen when the verdict was finally delivered? The next morning, the courthouse was filled to capacity. The tension was almost unbearable as Carter took his seat, the weight of the gavel in his hand heavier than ever. As he scanned the room, his eyes met Olea's for a brief moment. There was no animosity in her gaze, only a quiet determination that sent a chill down his spine. For the first time, he realized just how much was at stake, not just for her, but for himself as well. The room fell silent as Carter prepared to announce his decision, every eye fixed on him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he opened his mouth to speak, the words hovering on the edge of the unknown. Judge Carter Montgomery cleared his throat, the weight of the courtroom's attention pressing down on him like an iron shroud. He began to read his decision, carefully balancing his tone to convey authority and neutrality. After reviewing the evidence and arguments presented, this court finds. The sound of the courtroom door swinging open abruptly silenced him. Heads turned as a man in a crisp gray suit strode in, his polished appearance contrasting sharply with the tension-filled atmosphere. He carried a briefcase and moved with purpose, as if unaware of, or indifferent to, the gravity of interrupting court proceedings. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Honor," the man said smoothly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "My name is Charles Whitman. I represent an interested third party in this case, and I have new evidence that may alter its course." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Carter stared at the man, his hand frozen mid-page. "Mr. Whitman, this is highly irregular," he said, his tone sharp. "You cannot simply walk into my courtroom and disrupt proceedings. If your party has relevant evidence, it should have been presented before now." Whitman smiled faintly, unfazed by the reprimand. "I understand, Your Honor, but this evidence only came to light last night. It pertains directly to both Miss Harper and Mr. Crane, and I believe it would be a disservice to justice not to allow its consideration." Aaliyah stiffened in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she exchanged a glance with her lawyer. Crane, seated opposite her, shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. Carter, sensing the rising tension, weighed his options. The rules were clear, but Whitman's sudden appearance introduced a wrinkle that couldn't be ignored. "Approach the bench," Carter said finally, his voice clipped. He couldn't afford to let this unexpected twist derail the proceedings entirely, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that Whitman's evidence was significant. Whitman handed over a sealed envelope, his movements deliberate. "Inside, Your Honor, you'll find documentation that speaks to the credibility of both parties involved in this case. I trust you'll see why it's crucial to the matter at hand." Carter opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents with growing unease. The documents were a mix of property records, email correspondence, and financial statements, but one detail leaped out at him: a transaction linking Crane and a shell corporation that had been used to purchase property adjacent to Aaliyah's. The implications were clear. Crane wasn't just defending his rights. He had been orchestrating a scheme to drive Aaliyah out, acquiring her land to complete a larger development project. But what stopped Carter cold was the second revelation buried in the documents. Among the financial statements was a payment, a sizable sum, from that same shell corporation to a name Carter recognized immediately. It wasn't Aaliyah or Crane, but someone closer to him than he cared to admit. The property management company that handled his own rental was listed as a recipient. The timing of the payment coincided with the months when his rent had inexplicably gone unpaid. The room seemed to tilt as the pieces clicked into place. Crane's operation wasn't just targeting Aaliyah. It had inadvertently pulled Carter into its web. The overdue rent, the late notices, the humiliating revelation in court. It had all been part of a larger, more sinister plan. And now, here he was, standing at the center of it, his authority and integrity hanging by a thread. Carter's hands tightened around the edges of the papers, his mind racing. He couldn't let this revelation sway him emotionally, not when the stakes were so high. But the weight of it all was almost unbearable. He glanced at Aaliyah, who was watching him with a mixture of confusion and concern. She didn't know yet. None of them did. For a moment, he considered setting the documents aside, pretending they didn't exist. But that would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. Justice demanded transparency, no matter how messy or uncomfortable it might be. Taking a deep breath, he set the papers down and turned to address the courtroom. "This new evidence raises serious questions about the actions of the parties involved," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I will need time to review these documents thoroughly before rendering a final decision. This case is adjourned until further notice." The gavel struck the bench with a resounding thud, but the noise did little to ease the tension in the room. Aaliyah stood slowly, her lawyer already asking questions in hushed tones. Crane, meanwhile, shot a venomous glare at Whitman, who remained unfazed. The courtroom emptied in a flurry of whispers and speculation, but Carter remained seated, staring at the documents before him. That night, Aaliyah found herself poring over her own files, trying to piece together what Whitman's evidence could mean. She felt the weight of something larger than herself pressing down on her, but the full scope of it eluded her. Why had Whitman appeared so suddenly? And why had Crane, who had seemed so untouchable, looked genuinely rattled for the first time? Across town, Carter sat in his study, the damning documents spread out before him. The revelations had placed him in an impossible position, one that threatened not only his career, but also his sense of identity. How could he face Aaliyah in court again, knowing that he'd been an unwitting pawn in the same game that targeted her? And how could he untangle himself from a conflict that now felt more personal than professional? The stakes had never been higher, and the lines between right and wrong had never been blurrier. But one thing was certain: the truth, whatever it was, would not be easy to uncover or to confront. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as Judge Carter Montgomery took his seat. A week had passed since the explosive introduction of new evidence, and the case between Alia Harper and Douglas Crane had become the talk of the city. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, while community members whispered theories about what the judge's final ruling might reveal. Alia sat at her table, her hands folded tightly together. She glanced at Crane, who appeared uncharacteristically tense, his legal team huddled around him like a protective shield. Carter's expression was unreadable as he called the court to order. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing. He had spent countless hours poring over the evidence, and the connections he uncovered had shaken him to his core. Not only was Crane's development scheme more corrupt than anyone had imagined, but its tentacles reached far beyond Alia's property dispute. It was a web of manipulation and exploitation, targeting small property owners across the city. As Carter began to read his decision, the courtroom fell silent. After thorough review of the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Crane has engaged in unethical, and in some cases, illegal practices to further his business interests. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The court finds in favor of Ms. Harper. Additionally, this case will be referred for further investigation by the appropriate authorities. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Carter wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, his voice firm, the evidence suggests that certain financial transactions tied to Mr. Crane's operations involve entities managing properties across this jurisdiction. These findings demand immediate scrutiny, as they implicate individuals and organizations in a broader scheme of exploitation. The tension in the room was electric. Alia exhaled sharply, relief flooding her features, but there was also a flicker of confusion. Carter's tone carried an edge that suggested he wasn't just addressing the court. He was making a personal statement. Then he turned his gaze directly toward Crane. "Mr. Crane, you sought to use this court as a shield for your misconduct. But justice is not a tool for the powerful to wield against the vulnerable. Your actions have undermined the trust of this community, and they will not go unanswered." Crane's confident facade crumbled, and he leaned toward his lawyers, whispering furiously. But the gavel struck before they could respond, sealing the decision. As the courtroom began to clear, Carter remained seated, watching as Alia gathered her belongings. For a moment she hesitated, then approached the bench, her expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Your Honor," she said softly, "thank you for seeing the truth. But it feels like there's more to this than I understand." Carter met her gaze, the weight of his internal conflict visible in his eyes. "Miss Harper, justice is complicated. Sometimes it reveals truths we're not ready to face." His words hum in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. Charles Whitman, the mysterious third-party attorney, was surrounded by reporters, his calm demeanor replaced by a look of unease. Someone thrust a microphone toward him, demanding answers about his connection to the case. But Whitman's reluctance to speak only fueled the frenzy. Later that evening, as Alia sat in her quiet apartment, she replayed the day's events in her mind. Victory should have felt sweeter, but the lingering questions left her unsettled. What exactly had Whitman gained from intervening? And why had Carter seemed so personally affected by the case? Across town, Carter sat in his study, staring at a letter he had drafted but couldn't bring himself to send. It was a resignation letter, one he had written after uncovering Crane's connection to his own property management company. While he hadn't knowingly been part of Crane's scheme, the mere implication of impropriety had shaken his confidence in his ability to serve as an impartial judge. But just as he was about to fold the letter into an envelope, his phone buzzed. It was an email from an investigative journalist who had been following the case. The subject line read, "New evidence in Crane investigation. Carter opened it, his heart pounding as he scanned the contents. The journalist had uncovered proof that Whitman, the man who had seemingly come to Aaliyah's defense, was not acting out of pure altruism. He was a competitor of Crane's, leveraging the courtroom battle to expose his rival's wrongdoings while securing his own interests in the process. The revelation was a gut punch, twisting what had seemed like a victory for justice into something far murkier. Carter leaned back in his chair, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. The battle between Aaliyah and Crane had been real, but it had also been a pawn in a larger game. And once again, it had been caught in the middle. As the city celebrated Aaliyah's win, Carter knew the fight was far from over. The truth was more tangled than anyone had realized, and the pursuit of real justice would demand far more than a single court ruling. For Aaliyah, for himself, and for the community they both cared about, the story wasn't finished. It was just beginning.